It was 11:12 on Christmas Eve when the city felt as if it had exhaled and gone mute. Snow fell in slow, polite flakes, turning traffic lights into watercolor blurs and covering the sidewalks with a soundproofing white that made everything seem further away. On a curb outside a nearly empty commuter station, a woman wrapped in a thrift store coat hugged her knees because the coat was not hers, and because hugging her knees was the only way she could pretend there was still warmth inside her bones. Her name was Paige Morgan. She had been 27 for 3 weeks. She worked at a small bookstore with crooked wooden shelves and an old bell above the door that no one bothered to mend. She spent her paychecks on shipping a thick envelope of pills and vitamins to the neat bungalow where her grandmother, Elalina, kept a pot of tea on the stove for anyone who came by. That night, Paige's throat buzzed cold. The breath she made was a pale ghost that her gloves could not catch. Her phone had died twice that evening, once when Marcus had said he'd be there in 10 minutes and hung up instead, and again when someone at the station had managed to pick her pocket so carefully she hadn't realized until she needed to call a cab. Marcus had not shown. Marcus never did show when things got uncomfortable. Marcus had been the warm center of a life that closed down in stages. First with promises, then with avoidance, then with an argument and a slammed door. Tonight he'd promised to come back and had not. He was somewhere warm, next to someone who kept their hands steady. Paige sat on a curb and understood with a clarity that made her chest ache that she had been left. Snow on the curb compacted into a damp, icy halo around her sneakers. She tried to keep her teeth from chattering, and when that failed, she breathed out hot and watched it break into tiny crystals and fall away. Each breath was an effort. Each car that passed threw headlights like questions, then continued as if she were an afterthought. The station clock read 11:12 and did not care. She could have stood up and walked until someone found her, but there was nowhere to go. Her apartment key was in the zipped pocket of the coat Marcus had borrowed earlier that evening, an old coat he had left behind when he went upstairs to grab his keys and never returned them. He had promised he'd be back. He had not. Small humiliations had accumulated until tonight's abandonment felt less like an accident and more like a reckoning. Then, through the soft hiss of snow, headlights made a clean, low arc across the street and stopped. For a moment, she thought it would just be another passerby. Instead, the passenger door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall enough that the snow line reached his calf, and the hem of his black coat cut a precise shadow across the pavement. He moved as if he belonged to places where people spoke quietly because of habit, not necessity. He looked at her, and for reasons she could not have named, yet his eyes held hers with a kind of appraising patience that made her shoulders lower on their own. He had a presence the way old houses have a smell, there before you realize it and difficult to ignore. People glanced away from him just a touch more than they did from other men. They made room in conversations when he appeared. Rumor made a habitat around that presence. Phrases half-formed in people's mouths that left out nouns and clarified nothing. There was an authority to him that suggested danger and a protection at the same time. He had a name people did not say lightly. He approached with large, careful steps, the snow crunching under his boots, and produced a coat, heavy, lined in wool. He held it out without a question. "You should come inside for a while," he said. His voice was quiet and shaped like gravel and velvet at once. "You'll freeze through." Paige, whose brain still worked by rhythm and muscle, lifted a hand to decline. Pride is a stubborn thing in small packages. She opened her mouth and found that the words did not match the trembling in her fingers. It's okay. I'll be fine." She tried to smile, and it felt like a borrowed thing. He slid the coat over her shoulders anyway, large enough to swallow her arms. Warmth enveloped her like a protective hand. For a weird second, she felt like a child again, the coat too big and the world suddenly ordered. "You're soaked," he said. "You shouldn't sit here all night." She had been abandoned. She knew how to read the signs. Men like him did not stop. People who carried that kind of quiet did not pull over for someone in a thrift coat. He had stopped. That realization arrived as a small, colorful terror. If she accepted help, she would be indebted in a way that had nothing to do with money. If she refused, she would spend a night leaning into her own shame until she believed it was all she deserved. "I don't want trouble," she said. She meant it in the way people do, softened, half hopeful. "I can call someone." He glanced at the station, at the empty mouth of the town, and then back at her. His jaw moved once, like a window shutting. "I'm Henry Renford," he said. The name and the cold air had a texture she couldn't place, as though she had seen it somewhere before and flinched at the recognition. "Come with me. I will protect you." The way he spoke the last 3 words, gentle, definitive, meant something different from what she'd heard before. It was not a boast. It was a promise made without ceremony. It held no law, no title, only a private decision that the night would not go on hurting her. She looked up at him, the storm gray of his eyes, the way his hands, when he offered them, were firm but without grasp, and she felt a small, absurd rush of hope that the cold would be lessened by human warmth. Paige hesitated long enough to make the decision her own. He led her up to a penthouse that was all warm light and soft edges, not ostentation so much as a curated quiet. There were books stacked in precise piles, a piano that had clearly been played often in private, photographs that suggested loyalty and travel and loss. A throw lay draped over the back of a chair like it had been put there to be used. For someone with his reputation, the place was devoid of grandiosity. It was furnished with care, an idea more than a show. A woman at the door, a hostess, greeted Henry with a composed cordiality and then melted into the comfortable respect people show to someone whose choices they did not challenge. She handed Paige a thick towel and directed her to a bathroom where steam fogged the mirror. The shower that followed was not a cinematic recovery scene so much as a small, fundamental salvaging. Warm water sliding over cold skin, something like permission to breathe. When Paige stepped out, wrapped in a robe that she had never seen before, Henry was in the kitchen with 2 mugs of something dark and fragrant. He set one across from her as if they'd had this ritual 1,000 times. The steam rose in a ribbon of safety between them. "You don't have to stay," he said. "You can call a friend, find a shelter." "I don't have anyone," Paige interrupted, the words tumbling out with more fierceness than she'd intended. "Not here, not right now. My grandmother, Alenina, she's alone. I can't just vanish." "You won't vanish," he said. "You'll tell me where she is." His tone was practical, not indulgent. She watched him as he shifted the mug between his hands, the only movement of the moment. When she told him the address, the small white bungalow seemed a long way beneath their city lights. "I can get you there," he offered, "now, if you want." Paige, who had folded herself into small negotiations so often that they had become muscle memory, felt a surge of agency switch on. She would not accept being rescued in a way that erased her choices. She would not be a charity project tagged to someone's conscience. She wiped her hands on her robe and looked at him. "Can I pay you?" she asked, because the language of money made temporary things seem less personal. He laughed once, a small, quiet sound that surprised her with its human noise. "No," he set the mug down. "Consider it a favor you can refuse." "Why are you doing this?" she asked. It wasn't an accusation, it was a question a cautious person asks when an unusual kindness arrives without a receipt. He looked at the mug brim, thinking, and the light in the room collected around the edge of his jaw. "Because I don't like people being left at night," he said simply. "Because sometimes the world is careless, and other times it's quieter than it should be. Because I know what it is to be watched and not seen." That was the first time he had said anything that hinted at an abyss behind him. He set his hands, palms down, on the table, careful, deliberate, as if his gestures were made to avoid breaking something nearby. His reticence held a little room for confession without explaining. Paige felt an odd thing. Trust wasn't something she'd thought she could give that quickly, but in that room, with the steam curling up and the mug between them, something about him suggested reliability rather than spectacle. She told him about the blue notebook. The story came out in fits and starts, how Elena had kept a little spiral-bound book of recipes with stains around the handwriting, how pancakes were the particular bridge between them, and how the notebook had survived moves and fires, and, once, a flood in a cheap apartment's basement because Elena insisted on saving the small things that tasted like home. There were things in that book that were less about ingredients than about memory. A smeared note on the edge, "Never forget to laugh," written in a pen that had melted across the page during a late-night attempt to fix a lopsided flapjack. Henry listened as if each sentence was a kind of introduction to someone he was being asked to meet. He did not smile often, but when he did, it was a small, private light. The mention of pancakes produced a curious softness in his face. "My grandmother made something like that," he said. "She kept her own little book with scraps folded inside it. Family recipes are stubborn. There is something of someone's life in the margin of a pancake instruction, and you can read a whole person between the lines." He paused then, in a voice that wasn't meant to iron anything out of place, added, "Do you still have it, the notebook?" "No," Paige said. "It's at her house. I used to steal a page to copy. I knew it was a sin, but I liked knowing how she made the batter thin and forgiving. Then her health got worse and, well, we moved a few times, and the notebook got boxed. She kept saying we'd find time to go through the boxes, but time is easily misplaced." Henry made no offer to retrieve it then. He didn't need to. The fact that he'd listened was itself an offer. Still, in the corner of the kitchen, something gleamed in a low way, an old ring box, its velvet showing the faint outline of an object that had once lived inside. He moved around the kitchen with predictability that kept surprise to a minimum. He made sure the tea was brewed for her correctly. He set down a plate. He stood to look out the window at the quiet city, as if he too were making a decision about what to reveal. Over the next hours, the city went unremarkable outside, and inside grew conspicuously human. They did not talk about sex or about the whispered dangers of his reputation. They talked instead about books and the way time could travel in the lines of someone's handwriting. He told her, a few minutes into the conversation, that there were reasons people kept their distance from him, reasons that had more to do with what others expected him to be than with what he chose to be. He used the word rumor precisely and did not bother to correct it. "People like neat stories," he said. "A man who carries quiet is easier to explain when you make him dangerous." There was a kindness in his flat acceptance that made her less angry. She liked being seen, even if the way he saw her felt like something quickly acquired and perhaps temporary. She felt the pull of relief, the kind that flutters and then anchors. When she stood to brush her wet hair, she did not feel watched. She felt accompanied. And yet, because she was someone who had been left without fanfare before, she kept a map in her voice of her own limits. "I can't just stay," she said. "I have work tomorrow. I have to go back. I have to at least get my things." He expected as much. "I'll have someone bring your coat," he offered. "If you want to lay low for the night, that's fine. Or, if you want, I can get you to your grandmother in the morning." Paige had been trained to be independent out of necessity. Accepting help had always felt like a small defeat. But what was happening now was not charity offered condescendingly. He did not make offers as a ledger. He made them as choices he wanted to make. There was a difference, she realized, between being rescued and between being invited into a safety that required nothing from her beyond being present. "Why would you do that?" she asked, because the question mattered. He thought for a long moment, as if the answer were a path he had to walk in his mind. "Because once, someone offered me a shelter for a night. It felt like being allowed to breathe. I don't believe kindness owes me anything, but I believe in returning it." It was a tidy, almost Victorian sentiment, and it would have been easy for her to accept at face value. But she noticed the way a man in his orbit spoke his full name in private as if it were a secret, how staff moved without asking permission. She'd seen the quiet attention given to him in elevators and offices. Rumor, she knew, was a garden where people grew their fears. Yet he had stopped for her on a night when roads were full of stories that might have left her in the cold. That counted for something. At some point, late into the night, the conversation turned from edges to smaller, ordinary things. He asked about her job at the bookstore and laughed, gently, when she described a regular who worried about the last copy of a battered novel. He told her, in a way that was part anecdote and part confession, that he had a peculiar affection for public space that still allowed for privacy, that he liked the idea of rooms that kept secrets. She asked him whether he ever missed something simple, a pancake on a Sunday, a call from someone who would not let them go. "I miss things," he admitted. "I have learned to let people keep their distances. I have habits like trellises for my loneliness." He smiled then, a little regretful. "But I also believe in small kindness. Maybe that's why I stopped." Outside the penthouse, the snow softened the city's edges. Inside, the kettle hissed and cooled. Paige, rinsing a cup, realized how tired she felt. Fatigue was an animal that could not be flattered away. It settled under the ribs and demanded rest. "Do you want to call your grandmother?" Henry asked, offering the phone. She handed the phone back with a small shake of her head. "Her number's in my wallet." He looked at her as if noticing a detail that had significance beyond the simple fact. "Tomorrow, then," he said, "I can take you." She nodded, and the nod felt like a choice and not a surrender. She would not allow herself to be the story of one more woman who had been plucked and placed as someone else's trophy. She also would not pretend she could do everything alone when the bones in her body were tired of pretending. Conversation turned toward sleepiness, and they each, in their different ways, conceded to the quiet of the city. He offered a couch, she chose a bedroom that smelled faintly of old paper and citrus. The robe was warm. The pillow was soft in a way that had been practiced into comfort. She slept like someone who had banked on the small goodwill of a stranger and found it true. When she woke, the morning was more polite than the night had been, less dramatic, more persistent. Sunlight, diffused through cloud, made the city feel like paper. Henry was gone from the room. There was the faint left-behind smell of his cologne, neither obnoxious nor insistent. A note lay on the bedside table in neat handwriting. "Coffee downstairs," it read. "I'll be back to get you when you're ready. H." She dressed slowly, the way someone who had been given a small miracle tasks themselves with gratitude. The kitchen had coffee and a bowl of fruit, and a staff member, an attendant with hands like work and a soft voice, brought her a plate of toast and talked to her without asking the question she feared most. Who was he? When Henry returned, his coat was already on and a car waited at the curb. He did not inquire about whether she wanted to return to the station where she'd been abandoned the night before. He did not make a grand gesture. He simply offered the ride, like sliding a door open. They were in the car less than 15 minutes when Paige's phone, replaced by the kindness of a borrowed device the night before, buzzed. Her hands turned to the screen to reveal the number that always made her stomach tighten the way ice makes a bowl ache. It was Elena. She answered because some obligations are gifts, too. "Gran," she said, and her voice found the small, precise place of love reserved for elders. A noise that could have been a cough and could have been a cough and a laugh met her on the other end. "Paige," the voice asked, "are you warm? Are you home?"
I'm not exactly home. She glanced at Henry, who was driving and keeping the conversation companionable but not intrusive. Gran, I'm with, the man who brought me in. I'm okay. Do you have food? Elelena asked, the way one asks whether the day had been fed. Yes, I'm at a place, Paige said. She felt ridiculous explaining this in fragments. How are you? Did you... Darlin', Elelena's voice frayed on the word with that tenderness elders bring. There was a scrape on the line, a shift of sound that made the inside of Paige's stomach narrow. I think I feel funny. My head's heavy. I took my pills. I tried to get up, but I'm dizzy. The world tilted. Henry, who had been listening with the quiet attention of a man who has practiced the art of not interrupting other people's panics, turned the car off the main road with a decisiveness that did not ask permission. He found a lane that stitched time more tightly and drove with a patience that bordered on urgency. Paige's heart started a precise, complicated rhythm, part fear, part calculation. Elelena's voice on the phone had been small and honest in a way that demanded something from her. She could have called an ambulance herself. She could have asked a stranger to help. She could have turned right and found a public phone booth. Instead, sitting in the warm car with a man whose reputation made people hush, she felt that same promise he had made in the darkness return to her like a second skin. He had said, "I will protect you." The line now blurred into the broader thing those words could hold. "Let's go to her," he said. He spoke to the road and then to her. "Tell me where she is. We'll be there before the snow gets worse." Her hands were small on the phone. She gave him the address, voice steady despite the frantic noise behind it. He repeated it in a low voice as if to memorize the map. He guided the car with a protective patience that had once more the shape of someone who moved through corridors where people obeyed him without being ordered. There was an economy to his speed, no bravado, just directness. As the car slid toward the neighborhood where Elelena lived, the scent of hot radiator heat and cheap apartment air and pans left over from breakfast rose in Paige's memory. She saw in quick, rehearsed flashes the blue notebook on the kitchen table with flour on its corner, the way Elelena's hand would rest on the spine like an offering. She pictured small domestic things as if they were anchors, the cat that waited on the windowsill, the kettle that always had water in it, a chair that would not let her be small for long. Henry parked not far from the bungalow, and they ran the last block in a way that knitted urgency into motion. Neighbors looked out in small, surprised pairs. A dog barked and then fell silent. Henry moved with the intensity of someone used to making calculations quickly and accurately. He did not fear the world. He simply measured it. When they reached the bungalow door, it was ajar. The hinges made a thin, complaining sound. Inside, the air smelt like burned toast and medicine. The living room light was on, throwing long shadows across the rug. Elelena sat on the sofa, a blanket around her knees, her face a map Paige had read all her life, soft, lined with habit, and suddenly yielding to the heaviness she had called dizziness. "Gran!" Paige cried, and then all the rehearsed poise of an adult folded away as she crossed the room. Elelena reached up with fingers that had always seemed to know where to fix a hem or press a stubborn button. "Paige," she said, and her voice was both present and drifting. "You came home." Paige took her hand, warm and papery. The cat jumped into Paige's lap and purred as if to anchor them both. Henry stood in the doorway like a guardian, and then, as if it were a natural thing, moved closer and placed his coat around Elelena's shoulders. He did not speak until she looked at him, blinking like someone recognizing a face from a dream. "Thank you," Elelena said, in the sort of voice that made time fold. "A good man has come." It was the sort of statement that required neither explanation nor cataloging. Henry's fingers tightened once at the edge of the coat, a small protective gesture. The neighbors had come into the hall now, voices low and an earnest kind of concern filling the room. Elalina's color had gone, a patchwork of whiteness parked under her eyes. The cat jumped down and padded toward the kitchen as if seeking the place where breakfast should have been. Paige's mind, efficient in panic, shifted into logistics and tenderness at once. She called the number for an ambulance because that is what you do when someone older speaks of dizziness that won't release. Her voice on the phone was precise, professional in an implausible way. Henry, nearby, did not take over. He only stepped forward when asked to help move pillows, to bring warm water, to talk to neighbors in a tone that made them relax as if they too expected things to right themselves. Elalina's hands found Paige's, squeezing with the soft authority of an elder who had taught someone to fold clothes and to hide money in a jar. "You go," she murmured. "You take care of your things. You make sure you eat. You do not let the world make you small." Those were the words Paige had been carrying like currency all her life. They softened something inside her armor without breaking it. She looked at Henry and saw, clearly now, why people watched him. Not because he demanded attention, but because something in the world around him made space for his choices. He had chosen, without drama and without need for thanks, to accompany her on a night that might have swallowed her. He had offered shelter, and then he had insisted on presence. He did not linger, however. He stood on the low side of the room, eyes clear and attentive, and in a voice that suggested they could make the right decisions if they wanted to, said, "I'll come with you to the hospital. Let me take you." Paige hesitated. This was a choice, once again. She would not be wrapped in someone's protection without being given the respect to agree. She took a breath that tasted like lemon and dust and said, "Yes." He said nothing more than that. He simply picked up his coat and his peas and led them through the small parade of neighbors who murmured thanks. In the doorway, before they left, Elalina gripped Paige's fingers. "Make him pancakes," she said, and the command wrapped warmth around the panic. Pancakes are a good test of a man. Paige laughed once because the absurdity of the request made the room release air. Henry bowed, a laugh in his eyes. "Pancakes," he repeated. "Then we'll have a list of what to salvage when this is done." Paige wanted to tell him she didn't need a list. She wanted to tell him she needed someone who would come back at dawn. Instead, she pocketed the small warmth of Elalina's joke and let the world move toward the hospital. When they reached the ambulance doors and the fluorescent lights and the rhythm of the waiting room, something else made itself known. The world will watch, and it will make of you a story if you let it. Henry did not try to script anyone else's version. He sat with his hands folded and spoke to the nurse in a voice that was plain and useful. He signed forms when asked without lingering like a man who had something to prove. When a doctor spoke, he listened. He offered to cover expenses if it came to that. And when Paige turned the offer aside with a stubbornness she hadn't known she owned, he simply accepted it, not offended, not patronizing. She had been abandoned by Marcus. She had been protected by Henry. The two men occupied different landscapes in her mind, one a fading and indifferent shore, the other a cliff with a guarded path. She could refuse him. She could accept what he offered. She could choose. When the doctor finally stepped out, grave and measured, he held news like an envelope of late mail. Elalina had had a stroke. It was not the worst thing that could happen, the doctor said, but it was serious and required observation and care. There were tests and ICU overnight, questions about medication and rehab. The languages of hospitals are precise and small, meant to close gaps between chaos and plan. When a doctor spoke, he listened. He offered to cover expenses if it came to that, and when Paige turned the offer aside with a stubbornness she hadn't known she owned, he simply accepted it, not offended, not patronizing. She had been abandoned by Marcus. She had been protected by Henry. The two men occupied different landscapes in her mind, one a fading and indifferent shore, the other a cliff with a guarded path. She could refuse him. She could accept what he offered. She could choose. When the doctor finally stepped out, grave and measured, he held news like an envelope of late mail. Elalina had had a stroke. It was not the worst thing that could happen, the doctor said, but it was serious and required observation and care. There were tests and ICU overnight,
questions about medication and rehab. The languages of hospitals are precise and small, meant to close gaps between chaos and plan. Paige's world hollowed and then filled again with urgency. She had, until a moment ago, been thinking in terms of pancakes and small domestic recoveries. Now, the small domestic was a life orbiting around the medical facades of a hospital and the threaded questions that come after breakdown. She looked at Henry as the doctor spoke and realized that here was the moment where all his quiet would be tested against the kind of care that does not announce itself but is a measured insistence. Someone contacting the right specialists, someone making sure papers were signed, someone sitting overnight. Henry stood and, without looking poseful, reached for the small things that made a crisis bearable. He found toiletries in the glove compartment, he organized phone calls in a way that made them efficient and unobtrusive, and he sat with Paige's hand in both of his and said only, "You're doing what you must, I'm here." Paige thought of Marcus, who had said he'd be there and had not. The comparison came unbidden and sharp. She could feel the old resentment flare like a poorly tended match. For a moment, she let herself imagine how easy it would be to walk away, to return to a life where she resolved her own wreckage alone. Then she felt her grandmother's hand in her memory and the blue notebook's thin vow of continuity, and decided that small gestures of staying meant more than any glamour of independence. "Thank you," she whispered. It was not enough, but it was true. Henry squeezed her hand once, almost imperceptibly. "You're not alone," he said. The words were simple and didn't sound like a promise so much as a decision, an action he would do again. The offer had weight because he had held it in the cold and then again when the lights were fluorescent and mechanical in a hospital corridor. He had shown up. Outside, the snow had picked up and hardened the edges of the world. Inside, the waiting room hummed with the ordinary procedural cares that turn panic into plans. A nurse offered water. A phone charged. People moved through the room like a choreographed system, and Henry moved with them, not as someone who made the rules, but as someone who made it easier for other people to act. Paige felt a strange, new alignment. Being chosen by someone who had the power to do otherwise felt like an imperative to choose back. She sat on the edge of a vinyl chair and imagined pancakes, flipped at the right time, browned in spots, jeweled with butter melting in the center. She imagined the blue notebook open on the kitchen table, pages worn like familiar hands. Those small rituals, pancakes, a cat's patient appetite, the indent of a name in a page, are how people stitch themselves back together after weather that threatens to unravel them. Henry's reputation would follow him like a shadow at noon. People would whisper and interpret and make tidy stories out of complexity. But in that thin, fluorescent room, when the doctor finally came to say they could take Elenina to a private room and observe her overnight, Paige felt a steady, decisive relief. She looked at Henry and, without spectacle, asked him if he would come back in the morning so they could sift through the boxes and look for the blue notebook. He smiled then in a way that showed teeth that had learned both patience and stubbornness. "I will," he said, "and we'll make the pancakes right." She wanted to ask how he would ever learn to make pancakes the way her grandmother demanded, thin and forgiving. But a new sound interrupted the intimacy. The nurse called for them by name. There were more tests, forms, and a time for the surgeon to explain things in the way surgeons do, carefully, with careful hands and factual comfort. The day shortened into thin afternoon light. Henry stayed with her in the room through the moving and the ordering of things, sitting at the end of the bed with his coat draped over the back of the chair, the way a guard might drape armor after battle. Paige watched him then with a kind of new curiosity. Under the surface of his outward certainty, there were things he didn't let anyone see, the small, private losses that make a man do what he does. She wondered how much of his reputation had been earned by necessity, and how much had been handed to him by people who loved stories of danger. He was an enigma, dressed in practical kindness and perhaps in professional distance. When the night came, it was not a tidy conclusion. Hospitals do not wrap endings in neat ribbons. They offer small arcs of progress and require you to return tomorrow. Henry sat in a chair that folded in and tried to sleep. Paige rested against the headboard, her hand warm in his. Eliana slept with the blanket up to her chin and breathed with the steady, machine-measured patience of someone held in the arms of modern care. Paige thought of Marcus, who had been a heater that cooled when the house got colder. She thought of Eliana, who had told her to make pancakes as a test. She thought of Henry, who had driven through snow without explanation. She felt the weight of the night refract into a dangerous, hopeful shape. To be seen by someone who could have done nothing and instead chose to do something was to be offered a way to rewrite the ledger of abandonment. She did not yet know what she would choose tomorrow. She did know in the small flame light of a hospital room that she could accept kindness and still be herself, that she could be rescued and still retain the right to leave, that being helped did not buy a bond she had not consented to. The clock ticked with a thin, mechanical patience, and the snow outside made the city hush. Through the glass, the world seemed at once fragile and manageable. Paige closed her eyes, and as sleep drifted toward her, like a soft wing folding over her shoulders. Morning found them small and practical. Henry arranging for a wheelchair, Paige clutching a paper cup of hospital coffee that tasted of patience, and Eliana blinking at the sunlight as if it were a new, if inconvenient, visitor. The doctors spoke in clipped sentences that turned to plans. Nurses checked vitals with the rhythm of lullabies transposed into charts. Henry sat close enough that his presence warmed the vinyl chair, but not so close that it encroached. His hands were folded the way they had been the night before. Quiet, sure, the hands of someone whose decisions had become muscle. "Do you want me to come with you tomorrow to sort the boxes?" he asked, as they shivered under the fluorescent light between tests. Paige's first answer was a reflexive no, old training against being indebted. But Elalina, when they wheeled her into a quiet corner and the doctor stepped out to consult on medication, reached a hand for Paige's and squeezed it. "Take him," Elalina said, voice thin but fierce in that way people become when they see what matters. "And make him pancakes. See if he'll remember how to laugh." Paige laughed then, a short, honest sound. The idea of Henry in a small kitchen, batter on his sleeve, was absurd in a tender way. She looked at him and felt something settle, an invitation that was still hers to accept. Before dawn, while the city was still finding the edge of day, Henry drove them to a storage facility on the edge of an industrial block, where boxes of lives were kept like reliquaries. Called Renford Holdings on the painted gate, a legitimate-sounding name with the kinds of deeds that make people trust locks. The lot keeper nodded to Henry with a deference that was practical rather than worshipful, and the gate opened as if remembering his key. Inside the unit, every smell was stacked: attic dust, cardboard glue, the faint lemon of polished wood. Boxes were labeled in a tidy, spidery hand: kitchen, books, linens. They pulled a wooden crate down. In the bottom, wrapped in a towel like a relic, was the blue notebook. The cover of the spiral life-guarded by innumerable stains and a corner folded in from years of being thumbed. Paige's hands trembled as she took it. The cover was as if time had written a polite apology in the margins. "How long has it been?" Henry asked. "Since before the last move," she said. Her thumb brushed the page edges. She opened to the middle, and there, in handwriting that leaned like someone's elbow on the table, was a pancake recipe with a note in the margin: "For Sundays, thin and forgiving." A pressed forget-me-not fell out and fluttered to the concrete like a small, blue confession. Paige laughed. A whisper turned bright. "She kept everything," she said. "Little prayers on napkins, match receipts with silly notes. My grandmother's life is folded into these pages." Henry watched her with the same patience he had shown since the station. He did not make the notebook his sermon. He treated it like a signpost, pointing to what mattered. "We'll bring it back," he said. "We'll make pancakes." In the car, the notebook lay between them like a shared obligation. They did not talk so much as inhabit the quiet that forms between two people who begin to measure a future together in small increments. He did not ask everything about Marcus's absence. She did not feel shamed into confessing every hurt. Instead, Powell of ordinary kindnesses was exchanged. Directions to the bungalow, an extra blanket in the trunk, a promise to call the rehab nurse in the morning. The tone was low and precise, as if both of them had learned to let promises be actions, not ornaments. Back at the bungalow, the kitchen looked smaller than she remembered, and therefore truer. Ilalana's stove had a faint ring of flour on one burner, like a constellation. The cat, who had ruled the windowsill for years, glared with the familiar aristocratic disdain of an animal who had seen several generations of inadequate suitors. Ilalana, pale but alert, held the blue notebook in her lap as if it were a talisman. They set to work as a family might, Henry carrying in groceries with a grace that did not call attention to itself, Paige sorting through the boxes, Ilalana sitting at the table with a mug between her hands and a look that measured small joys against the larger trouble of recuperation. There were practical moments, calling the rehab coordinator, arranging a visiting nurse, finding a safe place for the pills, that Henry handled with an efficiency that made it clear he was used to solving problems by being present rather than by showing off the solutions. "You make the batter like this," Ilalana instructed, flipping through the notebook to her annotated page. Her hand, pale and freckled, traced the margin where a note read in her careful script, "Thin heart first." They laughed at the old phrase because it sounded ridiculous, then paused to let the ridiculousness become tender. Henry stood at the counter, his sleeves rolled neatly, flour dusting the cuff of his shirt like a mild compromise. He watched as Paige measured, folded, stirred. At first, his movements were precise and practiced for a purpose unknown. Courses taken, kitchen supervised, lunches assembled. But as they worked, he ceded the center of the stove to Paige and let her teach him the rhythm of the flip. Not too soon, not too late, a turn like a promise. "Thin and forgiving," he repeated when she said the words, and then tried the first pancake. It came out brown in the middle and pale at the edges, then slid off with a soft rustle onto the plate. He tasted it with the kind of small pleasure a man who seldom indulged might permit himself. "Not bad," Paige said, because the truth was kind in a way that made both of them grin. They ate at the chipped kitchen table, laughter soft as the cat's contented rumble. Ilalana watched them as if appraising whether the recipe held truths unchanged. Then, in a moment that felt like an exchange of vows without the formality, Ilalana reached into a small wooden box on the shelf and took out a ring. Then, with a small, worn stone set in a way that suggested decades of fingers and promises. "This belonged to my mother," Ilalana said, voice small but steady. "It's done more work than its weight suggests. If anyone is going to make pancakes with Henry Renford, it should be someone wearing a ring that remembers the smell of batter." Paige looked at Henry, who met her gaze without theatrics. The ring was not an offer. It was an invitation to consider continuing, not under obligation, but under witness. He took Paige's hand and said, quietly, "If you'd let me, I'd like to offer you this as a way of asking something smaller than forever. Will you let me try? Let me be someone who shows up for you." Paige felt the room breathe with the audacity of the question. She had not been looking for proposals or promises that matched fairy tale arcs. She had been looking for simple truths. Will you stay when it is ugly, asleep, ill? Will you hold the ordinary and still be faithful? This was not a demand. It was a request couched in small detail. "Yes," she said, and the word was less a surrender than a decision. "Yes, I will let you try." They sealed that decision with a kiss soft as the steam rising from the plate.
A forehead kiss first, because there are intimacies that are louder when they begin small. Ilanina smiled, an expression that suggested a woman who had loved enough to know the difference between a storm and a shelter. Then make him pancakes well, she said, and don't let him pretend he knows everything about the world. The days that followed were not cinematic montages of healing. They were stitches, appointments, phone calls, early mobilization exercises, the awkwardness of visitors who did not know how to act around a man with a reputation and a woman trying to heal. Henry was there in ways that mattered, calling specialists, arranging a home nurse, making sure a neighbor who volunteered to pick up groceries remembered the cat's diet. He answered calls with a competence that did not ask for gratitude, but still elicited it. Paige found that his presence did not erase her independence, it enabled it. Not everyone, of course, found it easy to accept that Henry Renford, whose name people said with a little hush, had reasons beyond the ones whispered in bars or on sidewalks. Rumor is a greedy thing. It wants stories that fit its appetite. It found Victoria Ashford hungry and persuasive. Victoria first appeared at the bungalow like a storm in heels. She arrived in the late afternoon when the light slanted and made things look like they belonged in the past. She was polished in a way that could have been a kind of armor and wore certainty like perfume. People who knew her looked away in a sort of practiced respect. Those who didn't simply registered the way her laugh could refocus a room. "Henry," she said when she entered, voice bright with the kind of ease that says one is used to being expected. She gave him a smile that carried the memory of other people's expectations. "I hope I'm not interrupting."
He stood and greeted her with the exact measure of welcome that gave the room a new, brief charge. Paige found herself sizing Victoria in ways that had nothing to do with the woman and everything to do with the story Victoria represented. There are ghosts that accompany certain kinds of love, names on past headlines, a photograph on an old mantle, the sense that someone else had once been the person who habitually came second in every waiting room. Victoria's eyes fell on Paige as if doing the work of a critic. "I wasn't aware he'd taken up domestic life," she said, with that smooth smile that could pass for concern. Paige had been braced for judgment. She'd had enough practice for the world to ask whether she was ambitious or opportunistic. But Victoria's words were precise, a claim and a dismissal wrapped in velvet. "You're very kind," Paige said, controlled. "Gran needs to rest. We're helping." Victoria turned to Henry then, and for a moment they were two people with a past vocabulary she was reciting from memory. "I thought we had an understanding," Victoria said. It sounded like a version of a confession and an accusation at once. Henry's face did not change much. He had the kind of expression that made people think he hadn't heard them at all. In fact, he had simply chosen which words to meet. "We had different paths," he said softly. "Some things end because they should. Tonight I chose to help someone." Victoria's mouth tightened. "This is a small life to be shared," she said. "You're used to a certain kind of company." Paige felt the old, small fear flaring up, the anxious whisper that she was an interloper. But Henry's response to Victoria was a surprising thing. He named the reality she implied without echoing her tone. "I'm used to choosing," he said, "and tonight I chose to come here. That's enough." Victoria looked at him as if seeing a man she thought she had the right to interpret. "You can't just throw your decisions away," she began. "I'm not throwing anything away," Henry said. "I'm choosing where to stand." The words had an effect like a bell in the room. Victoria's posture faltered only slightly, and then she let herself smile with the practiced smoothness of someone who could make an exit without ruin. "Then choose wisely," she said, and left as if the door had been held open by polite hands. She did not leave quietly. The next weeks brought a campaign of small undermining. A favor withdrawn here, a rumor nudged into a whisper there. Invitations were rescinded. A charity gala that Henry had been expected to attend became suddenly private. People asked questions in hallways and then apologized for asking with the kind of contrition that makes gossip bloom. Paige found the campaign bewildering at first, but not dangerous. Henry's world had defensive mechanisms. His allies did not need to be convinced by sophistry. What bothered her most, quietly, was the way the whispering made her feel like a test subject rather than a person being chosen. "Do you want me to handle her?" Henry asked one evening when they found themselves alone in the small, light-fingered kitchen. He was steady, and the question was gentle. "No," Paige said, and the word felt like a small stone dropped into a pond. "We don't need fights. I don't want to be the thing you fight for. I want to be the one you choose when no one is watching." He nodded. "Then I will choose you in plain sight," he said. "I will make sure that anyone who assumes she's the default learns otherwise." And choose he did, not with spectacle, but with the quiet removal of ambiguity. At a memorial service for a friend, when Victoria drifted into a room like a rumor wearing silk, Henry took Paige's hand and kept it. He did not make a scene. He simply existed in an arrangement that claimed her without theatrics. People who had been watching adjusted. Their stories reassembled around a new fact. Henry Renford, that man with rumors trailing behind him, was willing to be seen with Paige in public places, at family tables, and in spaces where his presence had once been enough to command silence. Still, healing is not a sequence of public proofs. It is a ledger of small acts. Ella Kleena improved in fits and starts, and Paige learned the rhythms of a caregiver. Medication times, physical therapy windows, the grocery list that must be followed for appetite. Each success came with a cost. Paige's days sprawled with errands and appointments, and sometimes the pressure made her ask quietly whether she had exchanged the kind of life she wanted for a steadying presence. "Do you regret anything?" Henry asked one wet morning when the radio inside the bungalow played some old song about making do. He sat across from her with a cup of coffee and his hands around it like a talisman. "Regret isn't the right word," Paige said. "I miss some things. I miss being able to decide where I spend my time without coordinating a roster. But seeing Gran get better," she added, and the sentence was its own small flame, "I wouldn't want to have done any of it alone." He listened without demanding her gratitude. "I'm not asking for thanks," he said. "I asked to be useful." She considered the answer as if weighing a coin. "I know, and you have been." There was a tenderness in the way the words fit. For all his reputation and for all the whispers, the center of Henry's invitation was reliability. He was not asking Paige to be something different. He was asking her to let him perform the act of staying. Time moved toward the latter months of recovery, and then, as if time itself were trying to be generous, Ella Kleena improved enough to leave rehab for the bungalow, with additional care. The first morning she set the kettle on the stove by herself was a small act of triumph. She watched them both with eyes that had the clarity of someone who had seen enough to know what made people last. "You kept making pancakes?" she asked on a morning when the curtains were open and the light looked like a promise. "Every Saturday," Henry said, quick as a child obeying a rule. Elena's laugh was a small, approving sound. "Good. A man who has pancakes in his life is less likely to be terrible." They continued the ritual of Saturdays, measuring, folding, flipping. It became less of an exam and more of a thing that anchored them, a steady smallness in the tide of larger obligations. As the months warmed, there came an invitation from Henry to visit his country house, public enough to keep rumor alive, but domestic enough to make sense. It was there, in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and coffee, that Henry did something both simple and profound. He had the ring in his pocket, the one Elena had approved, cleaned, and polished, and wrapped in tissue like a private history. When he reached for it, he felt the weight of the decision and the craft of the choice. To give someone a ring is to offer a narrative, one you cannot control and which other people will read in their own language. Henry had chosen to make the offer small and real. He found Paige alone by the sink, hands wet, eyes on the window where the orchard showed a bruise of late blossoms. He said nothing at first. The house was full of birdsong and the sound of their lives being ordinary. "Paige," he said finally. He reached into his pocket with a deliberate slowness and produced the ring. "I don't have a story that is easy to explain," he said. "I have a past that people like to make into fictions. I have power, and that power has sometimes been a shield and sometimes a barrier. What I do have is the ability to stay. I would like to offer you this ring, my grandmother's. It's not a contract, it's a witness. It says I want to try to make life better by showing up." Paige felt the words like a tide lifting a boat. She thought of nights on curbs and the taste of cold in her teeth, of mornings at her grandmother's table and the blue notebook with its faint stains and cheap spiral. She thought of the way Henry had come to the hospital and how his quiet hands had folded into the small business of being useful. She thought of the way he had chosen her in public and in hallways and at the stove. "Will you marry me?" he asked, the question small and exact as a key. Her answer was not immediate, perhaps because the word had to be the one that came from her own center. "Yes," she said, again, a decision, conscious and deliberate. "Yes, I will marry you." They did not plan a large wedding. Neither of them wanted fireworks that would feed rumor. Instead, they invited what felt necessary. Ilalana, a handful of neighbors who had become friends at Tuesday night checkups, a quiet officiant who had known Ilalana all her life, and a few people from Henry's orbit who carried the sort of respect that needed no show. The ceremony was small and honest. The vows were things they could keep: to show up, to argue without annihilation, to make pancakes faithfully, to put the other before reputation when it mattered. Ilalana sat on a chair with a small comfort cushion and watched them with the kind of proud stubbornness only elders own. When Henry slid the ring onto Paige's finger, his eyes found Ilalana's and promised not to let the gesture be mere theater. Ilalana reached out and touched Paige's cheek, her hand light as a benediction. "Make him pancakes well," she said again, this time as both joke and command. "And make him keep his promises." They built the day not as a spectacle, but as a gathering of the small and true. If there were whispers at the edges, they circled like distant gulls and did not land. The important things, hands, vows, the blue notebook placed briefly on a folding table as a witness, were done with the attention of people who know the weight of ordinary work. After the wedding, the real labor of marriage began, the kind of daily tending no grand rumor could upstage. They argued about how to arrange the bookshelf, about whether to hire a home nurse full-time, about who would call which specialist. These were the real fights and the real reconciliations, and they were mostly unremarkable, which is the point. Paige kept her job at the bookstore for a time because she needed to, because it was part of her identity and not something anyone could buy for her. Henry respected that without making it a bargain. He was present in ways tied to resources, arranging for a better physiotherapy plan for Ilalana, making sure the bungalow had a proper ramp. But he was also present in ways that changed him, learning the small names of neighbors, laughing at some of Paige's bookstore regulars, and setting aside time for pancake practice even when his calendar said otherwise. One winter evening, as the anniversary of the night at the station approached, Paige found herself thinking about that curb with new, complicated affection. It had been a place of shame and terror, and also the place where a coat had been draped over her shoulders and a promise spoken. She suggested, half lightly and half seriously, that they should go back on the exact date. "You mean to celebrate being stranded?" Henry asked, raising his eyebrows. "To remember what was the worst night and how it turned," Paige said. He held her hand and, without letting the gravity of publicity become an issue, agreed. "Let's go back," he said. "Let's take our pancakes and prove the world wrong about beginnings." On the anniversary, snow fell like careful applause. The station was quieter than she remembered. The bench where she'd curled up had been replaced with a new strip of concrete, clean and indifferent. It looked at first like no place for a commemoration, but for Paige it was the axis of a life rewritten. She and Henry stood together and looked at the track where trains hummed, and she felt a strange, intimate pride. This had been where she thought the story would end. Instead, it had begun. They didn't make a show of their return. No press, no announcement, just the two of them with a thermos of pancakes in a small insulated tin Henry carried like a relic. They set a blanket down, and the station, early on a Sunday, allowed them the privacy of strangers and the warmth of a small ritual. He handed her a pancake warm from a tiny portable skillet. She bit into it and found, as the blue notebook had promised, a thin and forgiving texture. She laughed, and it softened the air between them. "You chose a strange way to keep a promise," Paige said between bites. "I chose a way that fits us," Henry replied. "Something true and small. Show up, feed you, stand where I can." They talked then about the year, the hospital, Ilalana's recovery, Victoria's meddling, the nights of doubt, and the steady Saturdays of batter and smoke. They spoke like people who had negotiated a private treaty, small daily obligations in exchange for peace. "He has a name, people whisper," a passerby might have said if they had noticed them. "He is the sort of man who does not stop for anyone." But the person who mattered in Paige's life had already answered those whispers. He had stopped when it mattered. Later, when they walked back into the city, Paige thought about Marcus, not with anger so much as a gentle, resigned pity. He had been a lesson. Being left had been a lesson too. Standing had been a choice. She felt the clarity of it like a warm sun on her face. At home, the ritual resumed. The cat demanded its share. Ilalana settled back into a routine of gentle sovereign rule over the kitchen table, and Henry puttered around in a way that had become domesticated into affection. Their story, as it unfolded, was less about the dramatic rescue and more about the long, patient work of being present for each other. Years later, they still kept the Saturday pancakes. There were mornings when Paige cooked and Henry watched, and mornings when he took over because she needed rest. The ring on her finger gathered the small nicks of life and smoothed them into memory. Ilalana's blue notebook was kept on a shelf within reach, pages dog-eared and shadowed with stories. They read from it sometimes, as if it were scripture, and sometimes as if it were a map of small domestic truths. Thin and forgiving, the margin advised. It proved to be an instruction in ways beyond batter. If you'd like to tell the story of someone who changed a life, if you have been rescued, or if you once stopped for a stranger, share where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to hear it. When they were old enough to measure life in decades rather than hiccups, Paige sometimes thought of that night on the curb as less of a wound and more of a hinge. It had opened onto something neither of them could have predicted, a life where protection was offered without ownership, where power chose to serve rather than overshadow. Henry's reputation remained, as reputations do, useful shorthand for strangers and a poor substitute for truth, but inside their small world, it mattered less than a bowl of batter and the promise to pick up the phone. In the end, the man with the shadowed reputation learned to live by a simpler code. Show up for people, keep the small promises, and let rituals stitch memory into safety. Paige, who had once been cold on a curb, kept her agency like a compass. She had chosen to marry, chosen to keep her job, chosen to accept help when she needed it, chosen to return to a station not to mark a wound, but to mark a turning. The last image of their story is intentionally ordinary, a Saturday in a kitchen that smells of butter and sugar, a small stack of pancakes, the blue notebook open to the page where someone long ago had written a note to laugh. Elena's chair sits at the table, empty now, but the house still holds her voice in its corners.
They eat slowly, content with the knowledge that the world will never be without storms, but also knowing that somewhere, often in the least glamorous places, someone can decide to stop and offer a coat. On quiet nights, when the city is muffled by snow and the station clock ticks like a memory, they will sometimes walk hand in hand back to the curb where it began. They do not go to make a spectacle. They go to remind themselves that beginnings are not always gentle, and that a strange kindness, spoken by a man with storm-gray eyes and a reputation people whispered about, can be the place you start again. "I will protect you," Henry had said once in the dark. Over time, the words proved less like a shield and more like a craft, daily, careful, and chosen. Protection in their life looked like making sure the fumes of a hospital night gave way to morning and pancakes. It looked like listening. It looked like the willingness to be present when the world tried to tell a different story. That was the promise he kept.